The air in the room has a weight to it, a stillness that comes only in the deepest hours before dawn. Your own breathing is the loudest thing you can hear, and even that seems to settle into a slower rhythm now, as if the body is finally accepting permission to rest. The world outside the window holds no demands, no urgency, just the quiet dark and the distant sound of nothing in particular. If you are comfortable, you might stay here for a while longer, drifting in that space between waking and sleep where time becomes soft and unimportant. And if you would like the company of these quiet narrations to continue, a simple mark of appreciation helps the channel find others who might also need a gentle voice in the darkness. The cold woke him again before dawn. Not the sharp cold of exposure, but the dull ache of it seeping through the wool blanket, settling into the spaces between his shoulders and the small of his back where the padding of pine boughs had flattened during the night. He lay still for a long moment with his eyes closed, cataloging the sensations that meant he was still alive. The stiffness in his joints, the raw places on his hands where blisters had broken and frozen and broken again, the faint warmth radiating from the fireplace across the room, weak now after hours without fresh fuel. Outside, the wind had died during the night, leaving a silence so complete it seemed to press against the log walls like something solid. When he finally sat up, the blanket fell away and the cold immediately tightened against his skin. He moved carefully, swinging his legs over the edge of the sleeping platform, feeling with his toes for the split logs of the floor. The cabin had held its heat better than he had expected. The chinking between the logs had frozen hard during the night, sealing the gaps more effectively than mud alone ever could. His breath still clouded in front of his face, but the water in the pot near the fireplace had not frozen solid. Small mercies that added up to survival. He rebuilt the fire methodically, the way a man does when he knows he will be doing it again tomorrow and the day after and for all the days stretching ahead into a winter that had not yet fully arrived. The embers had held, buried deep in the ash bed where he had banked them before sleeping. He uncovered them carefully, added a handful of the smallest twigs he had gathered the day before, and blew gently until the first flame appeared. The fire grew in stages, twigs to finger-thick branches to wrist-thick splits of pine that caught with a sound like distant applause. The warmth began to push back against the cold, slowly, grudgingly, but unmistakably. He ate the last of the rabbit while the fire strengthened. The meat had been cooked 2 days ago and reheated twice since, but it was still food and still nourishing and still better than the alternative of going without. He chewed slowly, deliberately, letting each bite soften in his mouth before swallowing. The cabin filled with the sounds of his eating and the crackle of the fire and nothing else. Outside, the world remained perfectly still under its burden of snow. By the time the first gray light began to filter through the single small window, he had already been working for an hour. The woodpile against the south wall had grown during the past days, but not enough. It would never be enough. A man in these mountains could spend every daylight hour cutting and splitting and stacking and still face the real possibility of running out before the spring thaw. The mathematics of survival were simple and brutal. Each day required a certain number of BTUs to keep the blood fluid, to keep the heart beating, to keep the lungs drawing air. Each log represented a certain number of those units. The only unknown was how many days the winter would last. He pulled on his boots, stiff from the cold, and wrapped a length of wool around his neck before pushing open the door. The snow had drifted during the night, piling against the door frame in a smooth curve that required him to push hard against it before the door would swing free. Outside, the world had been remade in white and gray and the pale blue of early morning shadows. The trees stood silent and burdened, their branches bowed under the weight of the recent storm. No wind moved, no birds called. The only sound was the soft crunch of his boots breaking through the crust of the snow with each step. The fallen logs he had not yet cut into firewood lay where they had fallen, half buried now, their shapes barely visible as hummocks in the snow. He spent the morning working his way along them, using the axe to cut through branches that had frozen hard as iron, clearing the trunks so they could be dragged closer to the cabin. The work warmed him despite the cold. His breath came in regular clouds. Sweat formed along his hairline and froze there, turning his hair into stiff strands that clicked together when he turned his head. By midday he had cleared 3 of the logs and dragged them to the splitting area near the woodpile. He paused then, leaning on the axe handle, looking out across the clearing toward the creek. The water still ran, visible as a dark line cutting through the white where the current was too strong for ice to form. He would need to visit it soon, to check the snares he had set along its banks, to break the ice that would be forming in the shallow pools where he collected water. But for now he stood still, letting his body cool slowly, feeling the sweat drying against his skin beneath the buckskins. The afternoon passed in the rhythm of the axe. Swing and split, stack the pieces, swing again. The work required no thought, only attention to the grain of the wood and the angle of the blade and the shifting of his weight with each motion. His mind drifted as his body worked, moving through memories of places he had been and people he had known, though those memories had begun to fade around the edges like old maps handled too many times. The faces of men he had trapped with last season had become vague, their names sometimes escaping him until he had stood still and searched for them. The streets of St. Louis, once so vivid in his imagination during his first months in the mountains, now seemed like something he had read about in a book rather than a place he had actually walked. The sun moved across the sky without warmth, a pale disk behind thin clouds that had moved in during the afternoon. By the time the light began to fade, he had added a significant pile to the wood store, enough for perhaps 3 days of continuous burning, if the cold held steady. Not enough, never enough, but the accumulation of small victories that might eventually add up to survival. He checked the snares on his way back to the cabin. 2 of them held rabbits, their bodies already stiff in the cold. He reset the snares after removing the catch, his fingers numb by the time he finished the work. The rabbits went into a sack slung over his shoulder, and he carried them back to the cabin with the satisfaction of a man who would eat tomorrow. Inside, the fire had burned low but not out. He added wood and set about skinning the rabbits while the flames rebuilt themselves. The work was precise, careful, the kind of task that required attention but not thought. He saved everything. The meat for eating, the organs for stew, the hides for tanning into something useful, the sinew for thread. Nothing went to waste because nothing could be replaced. The cabin filled with the smell of fresh meat and wood smoke and the faint musky scent of wet wool drying near the fire. He ate again as darkness settled fully outside. The meat was good, fresh and hot, and he chewed it with the focus of a man who understood that each meal might be his last. Not from fear, but from experience. He had seen men die with full bellies and men die hungry and men die in between. The mountains made no distinctions. They simply presented conditions, and men either met them or did not. After eating, he sat on the 3-legged stool and stared at the fire. The flames moved in patterns that were always changing and always the same, and he watched them without really seeing them, his mind empty of thought, his body slowly warming after the long day in the cold. This was the part of the day he had come to value most. Not the work, not the eating, not the sleeping, but this in-between time when nothing was required of him except to sit and be warm and listen to the fire and the settling of the cabin around him. The walls had frozen solid during the night and were slowly thawing now, releasing small sounds into the silence. The logs expanded and contracted with the changing temperature, groaning softly against the notches that held them in place. The roof beams settled under the weight of the snow above, transmitting small creaks through the structure. The cabin breathed with the cold, and he had learned to read its sounds the way a sailor reads the sounds of a ship at sea. Each noise told him something about the condition of his shelter. Whether the roof held, whether the walls remained sealed, whether the chimney drew properly. The cabin spoke to him in its own language, and he listened without thinking about it, the way a man listens to his own body for signs of illness or health. He added more wood to the fire before lying down on the sleeping platform. The pine boughs beneath his blanket had flattened further, but he was too tired to gather fresh ones. Tomorrow he would replace them, or the day after. It did not matter as long as he could sleep and wake and sleep again. He pulled the blanket up to his chin and stared at the ceiling, visible in the firelight as a patchwork of bark sheets and poles and the dark gaps between them where the smoke had stained the wood. The fire murmured in the hearth, and the cabin settled around him, and the cold pressed against the walls but did not enter. Sleep came slowly, the way it always did in this place. Not the instant unconsciousness of exhaustion, but a gradual fading, a loosening of the boundaries between waking and dreaming. His thoughts wandered without direction. The faces of Cooper and Fitzgerald appeared briefly, then dissolved into the darkness behind his eyes. He wondered if they had reached their own cabin safely, if they sat now before their own fire, if they thought of him at all, or if he had already faded from their minds the way they had begun to fade from his. It did not matter either way. The mountains had their own ways of connecting men and separating them, and none of it was personal. He woke once in the night to add wood to the fire. The cabin had cooled during his sleep, the cold pressing closer to the sleeping platform than it had been when he first lay down. He moved automatically, rising, crossing to the fireplace, adding splits from the pile beside the hearth, waiting until they caught before returning to the platform. The whole process took perhaps 5 minutes, and he was asleep again within moments of lying back down. The fire burned steadily through the remaining hours of darkness, and the cold held at bay, and he slept without dreaming. Morning came gray and still. The clouds that had moved in during the previous afternoon had thickened overnight, and now they hung low over the clearing, heavy with the promise of more snow. He stood in the doorway after building up the fire, studying the sky with the attention of a man who had learned to read weather the way others read books. The air had a weight to it that spoke of coming precipitation. The temperature had risen slightly during the night, another sign that snow was on the way. He had perhaps a day, maybe less, before the next storm moved through. He spent the morning preparing. The woodpile needed to be covered against the coming snow, so he cut more poles and laid them across the top of the stack, then piled bark over them to create a crude roof that would shed the worst of the accumulation. The rabbits from yesterday needed to be smoked for longer storage, so he built up the fire and arranged strips of meat on a rack of green sticks suspended above the flames. The water hole at the creek needed to be cleared of ice, so he took the axe and walked down to break through the new skin that had formed overnight, filling his pot and canteen before the hole could freeze again. By midday, the first flakes had begun to fall. Small at first, drifting almost hesitantly through the gray air, then larger and more determined as the afternoon wore on. He worked through it, bringing in extra armloads of wood, checking the snares one last time, making sure everything that needed to be inside was inside. The snow accumulated as he worked, building on his shoulders and the hood of his buckskins, melting where his body heat touched it and freezing again where the cold could reach. Inside, the cabin had grown dim with the heavy cloud cover and the snow falling past the single window. He lit a second fire in the hearth, building it larger than usual to push back against the gloom and the cold and the growing weight of the silence. The meat smoked above the flames, filling the space with an aroma that was almost enough to disguise the smell of wet wool and damp leather and his own unwashed body. He sat on the stool and watched the meat and the fire and the snow falling past the window, and he felt something that might have been contentment if he had allowed himself to name it. The storm continued through the afternoon and into the evening. The wind picked up as darkness fell, driving the snow against the cabin walls with a sound like sand against stone. The temperature dropped again, the brief warming of the storm's arrival giving way to the deeper cold that followed in its wake. He added wood to the fire regularly, feeding it with the same automatic attention he brought to his own breathing. The cabin held. The roof held. The walls held. The chimney drew the smoke up and away, and the fire burned steadily, and he sat before it and watched the flames and waited. He ate again when hunger made itself known. The smoked meat had not finished curing, so he cooked fresh strips from the remaining rabbit, holding them over the fire on a green stick until the fat sizzled and dripped onto the coals. The meal was simple and satisfying and over too quickly. He sat afterward with nothing to do but watch the fire and listen to the wind and wait for sleep to come. The night stretched long before him. He had learned to fill these hours with small tasks, with the maintenance of his tools and the mending of his clothes and the slow, careful work of turning raw materials into useful objects. Tonight he worked on a new pair of moccasins, cutting the hide from one of the rabbits he had taken earlier, shaping it with his knife, punching holes with an awl made from a sharpened piece of deer bone. The work required attention and patience, and it passed the time in a way that felt productive even when it was not strictly necessary. His old moccasins would last another week, another month, but having a spare pair ready meant one less thing to worry about when the deep cold came. The wind howled outside, and the snow continued to fall, and he worked by firelight on the small project in his hands. The cabin held him in its warm embrace, and he held the hide in his, and the needle passed through the holes with a soft scraping sound that was almost too quiet to hear above the fire. Time passed without his noticing. The fire burned down, and he added wood and worked some more and added wood again, and eventually the moccasins began to take shape, rough and primitive but serviceable, good enough for walking in snow, good enough for another month of survival in these mountains. When he finally lay down on the sleeping platform, the storm still raged outside. He could hear it pressing against the walls, testing the roof, searching for weaknesses. The cabin answered with small sounds of resistance, the creak of logs bearing weight, the groan of poles under the accumulating snow, the steady hiss of the fire that pushed back against the cold. He listened to these sounds as he drifted towards sleep, letting them become part of the rhythm of his breathing, letting them carry him down into the darkness where dreams waited and the world outside could not follow. He woke once more during the night, not to the cold but to a sound that did not belong. Not the wind, not the cabin settling, but something else. He lay still, listening, his hand moving to the rifle that rested beside the sleeping platform. The sound came again, a soft thump from the roof, then a sliding rush, then silence. Snow, he realized. A mass of it had slid from the roof where the pitch was not steep enough to shed it cleanly. The cabin had held, as it always held, and the sound was just another voice in the conversation between shelter and storm. He released the rifle and closed his eyes and let sleep take him again. Morning revealed a world transformed. The snow had stopped during the night, and the clouds had broken, and the sun rose into a sky so clear and blue it hurt to look at. The cold had intensified with the clearing, sharp and biting, the kind of cold that froze exposed skin in moments and made each breath feel like swallowing glass. He stood in the doorway and surveyed the damage. The snow had drifted against the cabin walls, burying the lower logs completely on the north side. The roof had shed most of its load, but a thick cap remained along the ridge, weighing down on the structure. He would need to clear it before the weight became too much. He spent the morning on the roof, using a crude wooden shovel to push the snow off in great sliding masses that crashed to the ground below. The work was treacherous. The bark covering was slick with ice, and the pitch of the roof offered little purchase. He moved carefully, methodically, never hurrying, never taking a risk that was not absolutely necessary. The snow came off in sections, and the roof lightened visibly, and by midday he had cleared enough that the structure no longer groaned under the weight. The afternoon brought more routine: wood to cut and split and stack, snares to check and reset, water to fetch from the creek, where the ice had thickened overnight and required more effort to break through, meat to smoke and store. The small, endless tasks that filled the days and kept him alive and left no room for thinking about anything beyond the next hour, the next chore, the next meal. He moved through them with the efficiency of long practice, his body knowing what to do without requiring conscious direction from his mind. By evening, the cold had deepened further. He built the fire larger than usual and sat close to it, watching the flames, feeling the heat on his face while his back remained cold despite the layers between him and the air. The cabin could only hold so much warmth, and the walls could only slow the cold so much, and there was always a line somewhere in the room where the heat gave way to chill. He sat on the warm side of that line and let the fire do its work. The days that followed fell into a pattern that repeated with only minor variations. He woke in darkness and rebuilt the fire and ate whatever meat was available. He worked through the daylight hours at whatever task demanded attention. He returned to the cabin as darkness fell and sat before the fire until sleep took him. He woke in the night to add wood to the fire. He woke again at dawn and began again. The routine was not monotonous in the way that civilized life could be monotonous. It was necessary, fundamental, the rhythm of survival repeating itself day after day like the beating of a heart. The snow deepened, the cold intensified, the days grew shorter and the nights grew longer, and the cabin became his whole world, the only place where warmth and light and life existed in an otherwise frozen landscape. He marked the days on the wall with the stub of pencil, each mark a small victory, each mark a promise that he was still alive and still fighting and still unwilling to surrender to the mountains that surrounded him. Somewhere out there, Cooper and Fitzgerald sat before their own fire, marking their own days, fighting their own battle against the same cold and the same darkness. He thought of them sometimes in the long evenings, wondering if they thought of him, wondering if they would meet again when spring came and the snow melted and the streams ran clear again. It did not matter either way. They were part of the same story, connected by the mountains and the winter and the simple fact of survival, even if they never saw each other again. The fire burned low and he added wood. The cabin settled around him with its familiar sounds. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the promise of more snow, more cold, more days of isolation and labor, and the endless fight against the elements. He sat on the three-legged stool and watched the flames and let the warmth seep into his bones. And he did not think about tomorrow or next week or next month. He thought only of the fire and the heat and the small circle of light in the darkness, and that was enough. The night deepened and the cold pressed closer and the cabin held against it all. He would wake again before dawn and rebuild the fire and eat and work and survive another day. That was what men did in these mountains. That was what he had learned to do. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond the walls and the snow and the trees, the mountains themselves waited, patient and indifferent, for whatever would come next. The fire had burned down to coals again when he woke, the deep red glow casting just enough light to see the shape of the cabin walls and the darker rectangle of the window where the oiled hide covering had frozen stiff during the night. He lay without moving for a long time, listening to the silence that had settled over everything after the wind died. It was a different kind of silence now, not the absence of sound but the presence of something else, something heavy and patient that waited just beyond the reach of the firelight. When he finally rose, his joints protested with the familiar ache that had become as constant as his breathing. The cold had crept further into the cabin during the night than he had expected. The water in the pot near the fireplace had a skin of ice across the top, thin enough to break with a finger but still a warning. He rebuilt the fire with extra care, adding larger pieces than usual, letting them catch slowly and build toward the kind of heat that would push back against the deep cold that had settled into the logs themselves. The meat from yesterday's catch hung on the smoke rack, dark and dry and ready for storage. He took a piece down and chewed it while the fire grew, the tough fibers softening slowly in his mouth, releasing their smoky flavor in stages. The cabin filled with the sounds of his eating and the crackle of the flames and the occasional pop of sap exploding in the heat. Outside, the world remained hidden behind the frost that had formed on the inside of the window, thick enough to block any view of the clearing. He spent the morning organizing the supplies that had accumulated over the past weeks. The smoked meat went onto the highest shelf, arranged by type and age so he would know which to use first. The hides he had saved from the rabbits went into a separate pile, waiting for the day when he would have enough to stitch together into something useful. The extra flint and steel, wrapped in oiled cloth, stayed in the small wooden box he had carved from a section of log. The powder for his rifle, carefully measured and stored in a series of waterproof containers, occupied another corner of the shelf. Everything had its place, and everything in its place, the only way to maintain order in a space so small that disorder would quickly become chaos. The frost on the window did not melt as the day wore on. He noticed this sometime in the afternoon, when he paused in his work to check the light outside and found only the white opacity of ice blocking his view. The fire had been burning steadily for hours, and the cabin was warm enough that he had removed his outer layer, yet the frost remained. That meant the cold outside had intensified beyond anything he had experienced so far this winter. The heat from the cabin was not enough to warm the glass past the point of freezing, because the cold on the other side was too strong, too persistent. He built the fire larger still and considered what this meant for the days ahead. The deep cold had arrived, the kind that could freeze a man's lungs if he breathed too deeply, the kind that could kill in minutes if shelter was lost. His cabin was solid, but the cold would test every seam, every chinked gap, every place where warm air might escape and cold air might find its way in. He spent the afternoon walking the walls, running his fingers along the spaces between logs, feeling for drafts. Most were sealed tight, the frozen mud holding firm against the pressure of the cold. But in a few places he found small leaks, thin streams of icy air that his fingers could barely detect. He marked them with charcoal and set about sealing them with more mud, mixed with ash this time, heated by the fire until it was warm enough to work into the gaps. The light began to fade early, as it always did. He lit a second fire in the hearth, pushing it larger than he usually would, accepting that he would need to cut more wood tomorrow to make up for the extra consumption. The cabin filled with light and warmth, and he sat before it on the stool and watched the flames and listened to the wind that had begun to rise again outside. The frost on the window had thickened further, spreading from the edges toward the center until only a small patch remained clear. Through that patch, he could see darkness and the occasional flicker of snow moving past. He ate again as night settled fully in. More of the smoked meat, chewed slowly, washed down with water from the pot that had finally melted completely. The meal was simple and satisfying, and when it was done he sat with his back against the wall near the fireplace and let the heat soak into his muscles. The day's work had left him tired in a way that was almost pleasant, the kind of tired that came from honest labor and would lead to honest sleep when the time came. The wind grew stronger as the night deepened. He could hear it moving through the trees beyond the clearing, gathering force, building toward something. The cabin shook occasionally with the force of it, small tremors that traveled through the logs and into his bones. He added more wood to the fire and sat closer to it, not from fear but from the simple recognition that the night would be long and the cold would press harder than it had before. Sometime past midnight, the wind shifted direction. He noticed it in the way the fire behaved, the flames leaning slightly away from the hearth, the smoke drawing differently up the chimney. The new wind came from the north, straight down from the high peaks, carrying with it a cold so intense that he could feel it even through the walls. He added wood again and wrapped himself more tightly in his blanket and sat watching the fire until his eyes grew heavy. Sleep came in fragments that night. He would drift, then wake to add wood, then drift again. Each time he woke, the cold had crept a little further into the cabin, pushing against the fire's warmth, testing the limits of what the walls could hold. He fought back with fuel, feeding the flames with the wood he had cut and split and stacked, turning stored sunlight into heat, turning the labor of previous days into the comfort of this one night. By the time the first gray light began to filter through the frosted window, he had burned through twice the usual amount of wood. He assessed the pile beside the hearth, calculated what remained in the stack outside, and adjusted his expectations for the day ahead. He would need to cut more, and soon. The deep cold had arrived, and it would not leave quickly. This was not a storm to be waited out. This was the winter itself, settling in for the duration. He pulled on his boots and wrapped himself in every layer he owned before pushing open the door. The cold hit him like something solid, a wall of it that stopped his breath for a moment and made his eyes water instantly. The snow had drifted during the night, piling against the cabin in new shapes, burying the woodpile completely on one side. The trees at the edge of the clearing had disappeared behind a veil of frost crystals hanging in the air, a glittering curtain that shifted and sparkled in the first light. He worked quickly, knowing that exposure would be dangerous in these conditions. The woodpile needed to be uncovered, the logs brought inside to warm before they could be split, the work done in bursts that allowed him to return to the cabin and warm his hands and face before going out again. The rhythm of it became its own kind of meditation. Out into the cold, work until the pain in his fingers became too sharp, back inside to the fire, wait until feeling returned, then out again. The morning passed in this pattern, measured in trips rather than hours, in armloads of wood rather than the position of the sun behind the clouds. By midday, he had brought enough inside to last through another night of deep cold. He had also confirmed what he had suspected. The woodpile was shrinking faster than he had planned. At this rate of consumption, he would need to cut more trees, and soon, before the snow deepened further and made the work impossible. He sat by the fire and ate and considered the options that were really not options at all. The cold demanded fuel. The mountains demanded work. He would give them what they required because the alternative was not acceptable. The afternoon passed in the familiar rhythm of the axe. He found a stand of dead standing timber at the edge of the clearing, trees that had died years ago and dried where they stood, perfect for burning with minimal preparation. They came down easily, their brittle wood shattering under the blows of the axe, sending up puffs of frozen dust with each impact. He limbed them where they lay, cut them into manageable lengths, and dragged them through the snow toward the cabin. The work warmed him despite the cold, and by the time darkness began to gather, he had added significantly to his reserves. That night, the wind died completely. The silence that followed was deeper than anything he had experienced before. No sound reached the cabin from outside. No movement of air, no creak of branches, no distant calls of animals. Just stillness, absolute and complete, as if the world had stopped breathing. He sat by the fire and listened to nothing and felt the weight of it pressing against the walls. The cold intensified with the stillness. He could feel it through the logs, through the chinking, through every layer between him and the outside. The fire burned steadily, but the heat seemed to struggle to reach the corners of the room. He added wood more frequently, watching the flames with an attention that bordered on obsession, willing them to produce more warmth than physics allowed. Sleep came hard that night. He lay on the platform and stared at the ceiling and listened to the silence and felt the cold waiting just beyond the walls. The fire murmured in the hearth, and the cabin settled occasionally with small sounds that seemed loud in the absence of wind, and he lay awake for hours before exhaustion finally pulled him under. The next morning, the frost on the window had grown so thick that no light came through at all. He woke in darkness and built the fire by feel, his hands finding the familiar shapes of kindling and fuel by memory rather than sight. When the flames finally caught and grew strong enough to illuminate the room, he saw that a thin layer of frost had formed on the inside of the logs near the corners, delicate patterns of ice spreading across the wood like ferns frozen in time. He spent that day in the cabin, not from choice but from necessity. The cold outside had reached a level that made sustained work dangerous. He went out only briefly, to fetch water from the creek and to check the snares that he knew would be empty because nothing moved in this cold. The rest of the day he passed by the fire, working on small projects, mending, organizing, preparing for the days when the cold would break and he could work again. The smoke from the fire rose straight up the chimney, pulled by the draft of cold air above. He watched it for a while, following the path of each wisp as it disappeared into the darkness of the flue. The chimney drew well in this cold, the difference between the warm air inside and the frozen air outside creating a powerful suction that pulled the smoke away cleanly. Another small victory in the endless war against the elements. He ate sparingly, knowing that his food supply was finite and the hunting would be poor until the cold broke. The smoked meat lasted longer than fresh, but it still disappeared bite by bite, day by day. He calculated and recalculated, adjusting his expectations, planning for a winter that might stretch longer than he had anticipated. The mountains had their own calendar, and it did not always match the one he carried in his head. The days that followed blended into each other. The cold held, day after day, with only minor variations. Some days were slightly warmer, allowing him to work outside for longer periods. Some days were colder still, confining him to the cabin for all but the most essential tasks. He developed a routine that filled each hour with purpose, that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied and his body moving even when movement was difficult. He cut wood when he could. He checked snares when he could. He fetched water and broke ice and maintained his tools and mended his clothes and did all the small things that added up to survival. And in the long evenings by the fire, he sat and watched the flames and let his mind wander where it would. The walls of the cabin had become familiar to him in ways that went beyond sight. He knew each log by its shape, by the pattern of its grain, by the way the light fell across it at different times of day. He knew which stones in the fireplace held heat longest, which gaps in the chinking needed occasional attention, which parts of the floor had settled and which still shifted slightly under his weight. The cabin had become an extension of himself, a second skin between him and the cold, and he knew it the way he knew his own body. Sometime in the second week of the deep cold, the silence broke. He woke to the sound of wind, not the howling of a storm but a steady pressure of moving air that carried with it the promise of change. He lay listening to it for a long time, feeling the temperature in the cabin shift slightly, knowing without seeing that the weather was finally turning. The cold would break, or it would intensify further, but it would not remain the same. By morning, the wind had brought clouds. He could see them through a small clear spot in the window frost, heavy and gray and moving fast. The temperature had risen during the night, enough that the frost on the window had begun to melt at the edges. He built the fire smaller than usual and went outside to assess the change. The air felt different, still cold, still dangerous, but without the sharp edge that had characterized the past weeks. The snow had begun to settle, the top layer softening slightly in the relative warmth. He walked to the creek and found that the ice had not thickened further, that the water still ran beneath it in the same dark channel, he had been using for weeks. The snares remained empty, but the tracks he found near them suggested that something had moved during the night, some small creature testing the edges of the cold. He spent the day working outside, taking advantage of the improved conditions to cut more wood, to clear the snow that had accumulated around the cabin, to check the roof for damage and make small repairs where needed. The work felt good after the confinement of the past days. His body remembered the rhythm of it, the swing of the axe, the bend and lift of carrying logs, the steady progress of the pile growing beside the cabin. By evening, the clouds had thickened further and the wind had shifted again, now coming from the south. He recognized the signs. Snow was coming, but a different kind of snow than before. Warmer snow, wetter snow, the kind that piled heavy on roofs and required constant attention to prevent collapse. He prepared as well as he could, bringing extra wood inside, checking the roof supports, making sure the bark covering was as secure as he could make it. The snow began sometime after midnight. He woke to the sound of it falling, softer than rain, a whisper against the roof and walls that grew steadily louder as the accumulation increased. He added wood to the fire and lay listening to it, the way the cabin responded to the new weight, the small groans and creaks that told him how much the structure was bearing. The roof had held through worse. It would hold through this. Morning revealed a world buried in white. The snow had fallen all night, piling deep in the clearing, drifting against the cabin in new shapes. He had to push hard against the door to open it, forcing a path through the drift that had formed overnight. The sky remained heavy with more snow to come, low and gray and endless. He spent the morning on the roof, clearing the accumulation before it could become too heavy. The work was slow and dangerous, the wet snow heavy and slick, the bark covering treacherous under his feet. He moved carefully, methodically, never hurrying, never taking a risk. The snow came off in great masses that slid down and buried the ground below, and gradually the roof lightened and the structure stopped groaning under the weight. The afternoon brought more snow, lighter now, dry and powdery, drifting in the wind that had picked up again. He worked through it, checking the snares, fetching water, cutting more wood. The days of deep cold had taught him the value of working while working was possible, of preparing while preparation was still an option. He moved through the hours with purpose, accumulating small reserves against the uncertainty of what would come next. That night, sitting by the fire with the snow falling past the window and the wind moving through the trees, he felt something shift inside himself. Not a change, not a realization, just a settling, a recognition that this was his life now and would be for as long as he survived. The cabin, the fire, the endless work, the isolation, the cold. This was what the mountains demanded, and he had chosen to meet those demands. The choice had been made months ago, in a different season, in a different world, and now he lived with its consequences. He added wood to the fire and watched the flames and listened to the wind and the snow and the small sounds of the cabin settling around him. The night stretched long before him, and he would fill it with small tasks and quiet thoughts and the steady rhythm of survival. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, and the day after, and the day after that. The mountains did not care about his plans or his hopes or his fears. They simply presented conditions, and he met them day after day, night after night, one moment at a time. The fire burned lower and he added more wood. The wind shifted direction again, bringing a different cold, a different kind of snow. He noted the change without judgment, filed it away in the accumulating knowledge that kept him alive, and returned his attention to the flames. The cabin held against the weather as it had held against everything so far. The walls stood square, the roof shed the snow, the chimney drew the smoke away cleanly. He sat in the warmth and the light and listened to the night and waited for whatever would come next. Sometime before dawn, the snow stopped. He noticed it in the silence that followed, the absence of the soft whisper against the roof and walls. The wind had died as well, leaving the world perfectly still in the darkness before first light. He lay on the sleeping platform and listened to nothing and felt the cold begin to creep back toward the cabin now that the insulating blanket of snow had stopped falling. When he finally rose and built the fire and pushed open the door, the world outside had been remade yet again. The snow lay deep and smooth and untouched, curving in clean lines over every surface, hiding all the rough edges of the landscape beneath a layer of perfect white. The sky had cleared during the night, and the rising sun set the snow on fire with light, a brilliance that hurt to look at and promised nothing about the days ahead. He stood in the doorway for a long time, looking out at the transformed world, feeling the cold against his face and the warmth at his back from the fire behind him. The cabin held him in the space between inside and outside, between the shelter he had built and the wilderness that surrounded it. He stood there until the cold began to bite too deeply, then closed the door and returned to the fire and the small tasks that would fill another day. The routine continued. Days passed, marked on the wall with the stub of pencil, accumulating into weeks, accumulating into a record of survival that stretched further than he had expected to survive. The cold came and went. The snow fell and melted and fell again. The woodpile shrank and grew and shrank again. The snares produced sometimes, and sometimes they did not, and he learned to accept both outcomes with the same steady patience. He thought less about the world beyond the mountains as the weeks passed. The memories had faded further, the faces and places becoming abstract, theoretical, like stories he had heard about someone else's life. The cabin had become his whole world, its small space containing everything that mattered. The fire, the food, the tools, the walls, the roof. These were real in a way that St. Louis and its bustle could never be real again. Cooper and Fitzgerald visited him sometimes in his thoughts, but even they had become distant, figures from another time. He wondered if they still lived, if their cabin had held against the same storms, if they sat now before their own fire thinking thoughts that were not so different from his own. It was possible, and it was also not possible to know, and he had learned to live with not knowing. The winter deepened toward its middle. The days remained short, and the nights remained long, and the cold remained a constant presence that could never be fully escaped. He had learned to live with it, to move through it, to work in it and sleep in it and eat in it. The cold was not an enemy to be defeated, but a condition to be managed, like hunger or fatigue or loneliness. It was simply there, part of the fabric of existence, and he accepted it as he accepted everything else. One night, sitting by the fire with nothing particular to do, he found himself thinking about the spring. Not with hope exactly, not with anticipation, just with a kind of distant curiosity about what would come after the snow melted and the streams ran clear again. The rendezvous at Green River. The other trappers he would meet there. The trading, the drinking, the stories exchanged around campfires. It seemed almost impossible to imagine a different world entirely from the one he inhabited now. He added wood to the fire and watched the sparks rise toward the chimney. The cabin held him in its warmth, and the night held the cabin in its cold, and somewhere out in the darkness the mountains held everything in their patient indifference. He sat with that knowledge and let it settle into him, becoming part of what he was, part of how he understood his place in the world. The fire burned lower and he added more wood. The night stretched on, and he sat with it, not waiting for anything, not expecting anything, just present in the small circle of light and warmth that he had created from the raw materials of the forest. It was enough. It had to be enough. It was everything. He slept eventually and woke to another day and rebuilt the fire and ate and worked and survived. The routine continued, unbroken, unremarkable, essential. The days accumulated on the wall, each mark a small victory that added up to something larger than any single day could contain. He did not think about the total, did not count them up and wonder how many remained until spring. He simply marked each one and moved on to the next, living in the present because the present was all that existed, all that could be managed, all that mattered. The snow deepened further. The cold intensified again, then moderated, then intensified again. The patterns repeated with variations, and he learned to read them, to anticipate what would come next, to prepare as well as anyone could prepare for conditions that could never be fully predicted. The mountains taught him patience, taught him attention, taught him to live in the moment because the moment was all that was real. Sitting by the fire on another long night, with the wind rising outside and the snow beginning to fall again, he felt something that might have been peace. Not happiness, not contentment, just a quiet acceptance of everything that was and everything that would be. The cabin held him. The fire warmed him. The night surrounded him. And somewhere in the darkness, the mountains waited for whatever would come next, as they had always waited, as they would always wait, patient and indifferent and eternal. The wind had been building since midnight, and by the time the first gray light began to seep through the frosted window, it had become a sustained pressure against the north wall that made the logs groan in a language he had learned to understand. He lay on the sleeping platform and listened to it, reading the sounds the way a man reads tracks in snow, interpreting each creak and shift as information about the condition of his shelter. The roof held. The walls held. The chimney drew properly despite the pressure differential. The cabin would survive the storm as it had survived the others. He rose when the cold became too insistent against his face, the blanket no longer enough to hold the warmth close. The fire had burned down to embers during the night, and he rebuilt it with the automatic precision of long practice, the motion so familiar they required no thought. Kindling first, then smaller sticks, then larger pieces, each added at the right moment to encourage the flames without smothering them. The fire caught and grew, and the warmth began to push back against the cold that had crept into the cabin during the night. The wind screamed outside, driving snow against the walls in waves that sounded like sand against stone. He stood by the window for a moment, clearing a small patch of frost with his thumb, peering out at a world that had disappeared into moving white. Nothing was visible beyond the closest trees, and even they were barely shapes, ghosts in the storm. He would not be working outside today. The snares would go unchecked. The woodpile would remain untouched. The water would have to wait until the storm passed. Today would be a day inside. A day of small tasks and close attention to the fire and the slow passing of hours. He ate from the smoked meat, chewing slowly, letting each bite last. The meat was tougher now, drier, but it still provided what he needed. He calculated again how much remained, how long it might last if the hunting did not improve when the storm passed. The numbers were not encouraging, but they were also not desperate. He had been in worse situations, though the memory of them had faded into the general background of hardship that defined this life. The morning passed in the rhythm of small tasks. He sharpened his knife on the wet stone, working the blade in long, even strokes, watching the edge develop a gleam that meant it would cut cleanly when he needed it. He checked his rifle, running a patch through the barrel, making sure the lock was clean and the powder dry. He mended a tear in his buckskins with sinew and a bone needle, the stitches uneven but functional. Each task filled time, and time was what he had in abundance on days like this. By midday, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind had grown stronger, the sounds against the walls more insistent. He added wood to the fire more frequently than necessary, partly to maintain the warmth against the increased cold, partly because the act of feeding the flames gave him something to do, something to focus on besides the endless howling outside. He sat on the stool by the fire and let his mind drift. The flames moved in their endless patterns, and he watched them without really seeing them, his thoughts wandering through memories that had become worn smooth with repetition. He thought about the river, about the journey that had brought him to these mountains, about the men he had traveled with and the ones he had left behind. He thought about the first time he had seen these peaks, rising against the western sky like something from a dream, and how different they looked now that he lived among them. The afternoons stretched long and featureless. He dozed by the fire, waking when the flames burned low, adding wood, dozing again. The storm continued without pause, the wind holding steady at a pitch that made conversation impossible if there had been anyone to talk to. The cabin became its own world, sealed off from everything outside, containing only him and the fire and the small store of supplies that represented his margin of survival. When darkness fell, it was impossible to tell exactly when. The gray light outside had been fading gradually for hours, and at some point it simply became night, the window going from pale to dark without any clear boundary. He lit a second fire in the hearth, building it larger than usual, accepting the extra consumption of wood as the price of maintaining his own spirits through the long hours ahead. He ate again, more of the smoked meat, washing it down with water that still held a chill despite sitting near the fire all day. The meal was simple and unsatisfying, but it filled his stomach, and that was enough. He sat afterward with his back against the wall, the heat of the fire on one side of his body and the lingering cold of the logs on the other, and listened to the storm and thought about nothing in particular. The wind changed direction sometime after midnight. He noticed it in the way the fire responded, the flames leaning slightly differently, the smoke drawing at a slightly different angle up the chimney. The new wind came from the northwest, colder still, carrying with it the kind of cold that could kill in minutes if a man was foolish enough to face it unprepared. He added more wood to the fire and pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders and waited for morning. Sleep came in fragments through the night, snatched in the intervals between adding wood to the fire. He would drift, then wake when the cold began to creep too close, then rise and feed the flames, then drift again. The pattern repeated endlessly, the night stretching into what felt like days, the storm pressing against the walls with a persistence that seemed almost personal. By the time the first light finally began to show through the frost, he was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. The constant vigilance, the endless feeding of the fire, the pressure of the storm against the cabin and against his mind had worn him down in ways he could feel but not fully articulate. He rebuilt the fire larger than usual and sat close to it, letting the heat soak into him, letting his body begin the slow process of recovery. The storm had broken sometime during the night. He realized this when he cleared the frost from the window and saw not the moving white of falling snow but a world transformed and still. The wind had died completely, leaving a silence so profound that his own breathing seemed loud in comparison. The snow had piled deep during the storm, drifting against the cabin in shapes that curved and flowed like frozen water. The trees at the edge of the clearing stood burdened and silent, their branches weighed down with white. He pushed open the door and stood for a long moment in the opening, letting the cold wash over him, letting his eyes adjust to the brilliance of sunlight on fresh snow. The air was so cold that each breath felt like swallowing splinters of glass, but there was no wind, and that made it bearable. He stepped out into the snow and it came up past his knees, forcing him to lift his feet high with each step, breaking a path toward the woodpile. The woodpile had disappeared under the drift. He spent an hour digging it out, uncovering the stacked logs piece by piece, carrying armloads inside to warm before they could be split. The work warmed him despite the cold, and by the time he had cleared enough to last through the next few days, he was sweating inside his layers, his breath coming in clouds that froze instantly in the still air. The snares had survived the storm, buried under snow but intact. He found them by memory, by the landmarks he had memorized, by the feel of the ground beneath the snow. 2 of them held rabbits, frozen solid but still usable, their bodies stiff and cold in his hands. He reset the snares and carried the rabbits back to the cabin, adding them to the growing pile of meat that would sustain him through the coming days. The creek had frozen more completely during the storm. He had to chop through a thicker layer of ice to reach the water below, the axe ringing against the frozen surface with a sound that carried through the silent clearing. The water beneath ran dark and cold, and he filled his pot and canteen and carried them back to the cabin, careful not to spill any of the precious liquid. The rest of the day passed in the familiar rhythm of survival. He skinned the rabbits, saving every part that could be used. He added to the smoke rack, building up the fire to ensure the meat would cure properly. He cut and split wood from the logs he had brought inside, building the pile beside the hearth back to a size that felt secure. He fetched more water, checked the snares again, cleared more snow from around the cabin. The work filled the daylight hours, and by the time darkness began to gather, he was tired in the way that meant he would sleep well. That night, sitting by the fire with the rabbits smoking above the flames and the cabin warm around him, he felt something that might have been satisfaction. The storm had passed and he had survived it. The cabin had held and he had held with it. The work continued as it always would. But for this moment there was nothing urgent, nothing pressing, nothing that demanded his attention beyond the simple maintenance of the fire and the slow passage of the evening. He ate well that night, fresh meat cooked over the flames, rich and satisfying in a way that the dried meat could never match. He chewed slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite, letting the flavors fill his mouth and his stomach and his mind. The meal was a small celebration, though he would not have called it that. It was simply the reward for work done, for survival achieved, for another day added to the accumulating count on the wall. The days that followed fell into a pattern that was becoming as familiar as his own breathing. He would wake in darkness, rebuild the fire, eat, and go out to work as soon as there was light enough to see. He would check snares, cut wood, fetch water, tend the smoke rack, do all the small tasks that filled the hours between dawn and dusk. He would return to the cabin as darkness fell, eat again, sit by the fire and sleep. The routine varied only in the details, in which tasks demanded attention and which could wait, in whether the snares produced or remained empty, in whether the cold pressed hard or moderated slightly. The snow continued to deepen. Each storm added another layer, another burden for the cabin to bear, another obstacle to moving through the landscape. He learned to move on snowshoes, the crude frames of bent wood and rawhide that distributed his weight and kept him from sinking into the drifts. The first attempts had been awkward, his feet catching on the frames, his balance uncertain, but practice had made the motion almost natural. He could now walk for hours on the shoes, covering ground that would have been impossible to cross without them. The hunting improved as the winter deepened. He did not understand why, whether the cold drove the animals closer to his snares or whether he had simply learned to place them better, but the rabbits came more regularly now, sometimes 2 or 3 in a day. The smoke rack filled with meat, and he began to think less about starvation and more about the simple abundance of the moment. He knew it would not last. Nothing lasted in these mountains. But for now there was enough, and enough was all he asked. He began to explore further from the cabin as the weeks passed. The snowshoes made travel possible, and curiosity drove him to see more of the landscape that surrounded his shelter. He followed the creek upstream one day, climbing into the foothills where the pines gave way to bare rock and the wind cut sharper than it did in the valley. He found a frozen waterfall, a cascade of ice that hung from the cliffs like something from another world, blue and white and impossibly beautiful in the thin winter light. He stood and looked at it for a long time, not thinking, just seeing, letting the image burn itself into his memory. Another day he climbed the ridge to the north, following a game trail that switchbacked up through the trees until he emerged above timberline into a world of wind-scoured rock and snow that had drifted into impossible shapes. From the summit he could see for miles in every direction, mountains stretching to every horizon, a vastness that made him feel small and insignificant and somehow grateful for that smallness. He stood there until the cold began to force him down, then returned to the cabin and the fire and the small routines that defined his existence. The cabin waited for him each time he returned. It stood square and solid in its clearing, smoke rising from the chimney, the door facing south to catch what little warmth the winter sun could provide. He had built it, and it had become home, and the word meant something out here that it could never mean in civilization. Home was not a place where you happened to live. Home was a place you had created, a place that kept you alive, a place that would hold against the darkness until you returned to it. One evening, sitting by the fire after a long day of travel, he found himself thinking about the marks on the wall. He had not counted them in weeks, had simply added each day without calculation, without allowing himself to think about what the total might mean. Now he stood and walked to the wall and ran his fingers over the rows of hash marks, counting silently, adding them up in his head. The number surprised him. More than 2 months had passed since the cabin was finished. More than 2 months of survival in these mountains, alone, against everything the winter could throw at him. He returned to the fire and sat with that knowledge, letting it settle into him. 2 months felt like both an instant and an eternity. The days had blurred together into a continuous present, but the marks on the wall told a different story, a story of accumulation, of persistence, of time passing whether he noticed it or not. There would be more months before spring, more marks to add, more days to survive. But he had survived 2 of them, and that meant something. The fire crackled and the cabin settled around him, and the night pressed against the walls with its endless cold. He sat in the warmth and the light and felt something that might have been pride, though he would not have called it that. It was simply recognition, acknowledgement of what he had done and what he continued to do. The mountains demanded everything, and he had given it, and he was still here. The weeks that followed brought more of the same, but also subtle changes that he noted without comment. The days began to lengthen, almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably as time passed. The sun rose earlier and set later, and the light that came through the window had a different quality, a promise buried in it that he tried not to acknowledge. Spring was coming. Not soon, not yet, but coming. The knowledge sat somewhere in the back of his mind. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it, something that made the cold slightly more bearable and the work slightly less exhausting. The animals seemed to sense it too. The rabbits grew more active, their tracks more numerous in the snow. He saw deer sign near the creek one day, the first he had seen in months, the tracks leading down to the water and back into the trees. He did not see the deer themselves, but knowing they were there, that they had survived the winter as he had, gave him a feeling he could not name. He began to prepare for the spring without quite admitting that was what he was doing. The meat on the smoke rack grew into a substantial store, enough to last through the final weeks of winter and into the early days of the thaw. The woodpile grew faster than it shrank, the days of cutting exceeding the nights of burning. The cabin itself received attention, small repairs, improvements that would make it more comfortable for the remaining months of cold. One afternoon, returning from a long day of cutting wood, he noticed something different about the light. The sun, low in the sky, cast long shadows across the snow, but the shadows seemed softer than they had been, less sharp, less defined. He looked up and saw that the sky had changed. The hard blue of deep winter replaced by something paler, something with a hint of moisture in it. The temperature had risen during the day, enough that his face did not freeze when he stopped moving. He stood in the clearing and let himself feel it, the small shift that meant the world was turning, that meant change was coming. That night, sitting by the fire, he found himself listening for something he could not identify. Not the wind, not the cabin, not the usual sounds of the winter night. Something else, something almost below the threshold of hearing. A shift in the quality of the silence that might have meant nothing and might have meant everything. He listened for a long time, and eventually he heard it. Water. The sound of water moving somewhere beneath the snow. A trickle so faint it was barely there, but unmistakable once he had recognized it. The thaw had begun somewhere, somehow, in some small corner of the frozen landscape. Not spring, not yet, but the first hint of it, the first sign that winter would not last forever. He sat with that sound for a long time, letting it fill the silence, letting it become part of the night. The fire burned low and he added wood. The sound continued, barely audible, persistent. He listened until his eyes grew heavy, then banked the fire and lay down on the sleeping platform and slept more deeply than he had in weeks. The days that followed brought more changes, each one small, each one significant. The temperature rose slightly, then fell again, then rose. The snow began to settle, the top layer softening during the day and refreezing at night, forming a crust that could bear weight in the mornings but broke through in the afternoons. The sound of running water grew louder, more persistent, as more channels opened beneath the snow. He began to see more animals. Rabbits still, but also squirrels, and one day a fox that crossed the clearing at dusk, pausing to look at him with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been hunger. He watched it until it moved on, disappearing into the trees at the edge of the clearing. The fox was a sign, though, of what he could not say. Life returning to the mountains, the cycle continuing. The cabin felt different now, though nothing had changed. The light through the window lasted longer each day, and the frost that formed on the glass each night melted more quickly each morning. The fire still burned, still provided the warmth he needed, but he found himself building it smaller sometimes, testing how little he could get by with, conserving the wood that had become so plentiful but might still be needed if winter returned with one last fury. He thought more often about the spring, about what he would do when the snow melted and the passes opened. The rendezvous at Green River pulled at his thoughts, the promise of company, of trade, of news from the world beyond the mountains. He would need to travel, to gather his furs, to make the long journey to the gathering place. The prospect both excited and troubled him. The thought of leaving the cabin that had become his home, of returning to a world of noise and people and complications he had almost forgotten. But that was weeks away, maybe months. The snow still lay deep in the clearing, and the nights still brought cold that could kill, and the cabin still held him in its warm embrace. He had time yet to prepare, to plan, to let the idea of spring become real in his mind. For now, there was still the daily routine, the work, the fire, the slow passage of hours that had become the rhythm of his existence. One morning, he woke to a sound that had become unfamiliar. Rain. Not snow, but actual rain, falling against the roof and walls with a sound so different from snow that it took him a moment to identify it. He lay listening, letting the sound fill the cabin, letting himself feel what it meant. Rain meant warmth. Rain meant the snow would melt faster. Rain meant spring was closer than he had allowed himself to believe. He rose and built the fire smaller than usual, knowing the rain would do some of the work of warming the world. He stood by the window, clearing the frost, watching the drops fall against the glass and run down in crooked paths. The world outside had changed overnight. The snow looked different, wetter, heavier, already beginning to settle under the impact of the rain. The trees had shed some of their burden, their branches rising slightly, released from the weight that had bent them all winter. He went outside without his snowshoes for the first time in months. The snow held his weight at first, the crust strong enough to support him, but within a few steps he broke through, sinking to his knees in the wet, heavy snow beneath. He did not mind. The sensation was new, different, a reminder that the world was not static, that change was the only constant. He walked to the creek and found it transformed. The ice had broken up during the night, great chunks of it floating in the swollen current, grinding against each other with a sound like distant thunder. The water ran high and fast, carrying the winter away with it. He stood by the creek for a long time, watching the water move, listening to the sound of it, feeling the rain on his face. The cold was still there, still present, but it was a different cold now, a wet cold, a cold that would not last. He could feel it in the air, in the water, in the softening snow beneath his feet. The world was turning, and he was turning with it. Back in the cabin, he built up the fire and sat close to it, letting the warmth drive out the chill that had seeped into him during his walk. The rain continued outside, a steady sound that filled the silence and made the cabin feel even more secure, even more separate from the world beyond its walls. He ate and rested and watched the fire and listened to the rain, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to think about what came next. The days that followed brought more rain, then more cold, then more snow, then rain again. The weather could not decide what it wanted to be, swinging back and forth between winter and spring with a violence that spoke of the struggle between the seasons. He rode it out in the cabin, working when he could, resting when he could not, watching the marks on the wall accumulate toward a number he had stopped counting. The snow melted in patches, revealing bare ground in some places while drifts remained in others. The creek ran high and dangerous, too swift to cross, too cold to fall into. The animals grew more active, more visible, preparing in their own ways for the season to come. He saw elk one day, a small herd moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing, their winter coats still thick, their movements careful and watchful. They did not see him, or if they did not care. They passed through and were gone, leaving tracks in the softening snow that would be gone by afternoon. He began to prepare for his own departure, though he did not rush. The furs he had accumulated over the winter needed to be bundled, sorted, made ready for transport. His equipment needed to be checked, repaired, made ready for the journey. The cabin itself needed to be left in a state that would welcome his return, if he chose to return, if the mountains allowed him to find his way back to this place. The work of preparation filled the days, gave them purpose and direction. He moved through the tasks with the same methodical attention he had brought to everything since the first day he had swung an axe in this clearing. Each fur bundled, each tool sharpened, each supply organized brought him closer to the moment when he would close the door and walk away from the shelter he had built. But that moment was not yet. The snow still lay deep in the passes, and the trails remained impassable, and the mountains would not release him until they were ready. He had time yet, days or weeks, to sit by the fire and watch the flames and listen to the changing sounds of the world outside. He had time to let the cabin hold him a little longer, to let the warmth seep into him one more time before he stepped out into whatever came next. The rain stopped one afternoon, and the clouds broke, and the sun came through with a warmth that felt almost like summer after the months of cold. He stood in the doorway and let it fall on his face, feeling it on his skin, feeling the way it transformed the world around him. The snow steamed in the sunlight, sending up wisps of vapor that rose and disappeared into the air. The sound of dripping water filled the clearing, 1,000 small cascades falling from every branch and roof edge and exposed rock. He walked out into the clearing and stood in the sunlight, feeling it warm his shoulders through the buckskins. The snow beneath his feet had softened to the point where he sank with each step, the water seeping into his boots, but he did not mind. The sensation was part of the change, part of the turning of the world, and he accepted it as he accepted everything else. The cabin stood behind him, square and solid, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin line against the blue sky. He had built it with his own hands, had lived in it through the darkest months of the year, had survived because of it and because of what he had learned within its walls. It would be here when he returned, if he returned. It would wait for him, as it had waited through the storms and the cold and the long nights of isolation. He turned back toward it, toward the door and the fire and the small space that had become his whole world. There was still time before he needed to leave. Still days of preparation, of waiting, of living in the rhythm that had sustained him through the winter. He would use them well, as he had used every day since the first tree fell in this clearing. The fire welcomed him back with its warmth, and he sat before it and watched the flames and listened to the world changing outside. The cabin held him in its familiar embrace, and he let himself be held, knowing that soon enough he would step out of it and into whatever came next. But not yet. Not yet. The fire had burned down to a bed of coals when he woke, the deep orange glow painting the log walls in shifting patterns that seemed to move when he looked directly at them. He lay without moving, letting the warmth of the sleeping platform seep into his back, listening to the silence that had settled over the cabin during the night. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, and the world outside had gone still in that particular way that came only in the hours just before first light. He rose when the cold began to creep under the blanket, adding wood to the coals, watching the flames catch and grow. The motion was automatic now, so familiar that his hands knew what to do without any direction from his mind. He had performed the same sequence of actions hundreds of times since the first morning in this cabin, and he would perform it hundreds more before the winter was truly finished. The light through the window had changed. He noticed it as he stood by the fire, letting the warmth soak into his hands. The frost that had covered the glass throughout the deepest cold had retreated to the edges, leaving a clear circle in the center through which he could see the world outside. The snow still lay deep in the clearing, but its surface had changed, softened by the recent rain, marked by the tracks of animals that had moved through during the night. He pushed open the door and stood in the opening, letting the air wash over him. It was cold still, but a different cold than before. A cold that carried the smell of wet earth and running water beneath the sharper scent of snow. The sky overhead was the pale gray of approaching dawn, and the clouds that had brought the rain were breaking up, revealing patches of deeper blue between them. The creek had risen during the night. He could hear it before he could see it, a steady rushing sound that had grown louder since the day before. When he walked down to check the water, he found the banks transformed. The ice that had covered the surface for months had broken into great slabs that piled against each other where the current slowed, grinding and shifting with sounds that carried through the clearing. The water itself ran dark and fast, carrying with it the debris of winter, branches and leaves, and the remains of animals that had not survived. He filled his pot from a pool near the bank where the water ran clearer, careful to keep his footing on the slippery rocks. The cold still bit at his fingers, but he could work without the constant pain that had accompanied every moment outside during the deepest cold. Another small change, another sign that the world was turning. Back in the cabin, he set the water near the fire to warm and ate from the smoked meat while the flames rebuilt themselves. The meat was almost gone now, the supply that had seemed so abundant weeks ago reduced to a few strips hanging from the rack. He would need to hunt soon to replenish what the winter had consumed. But not yet. There was still time, still a margin to work with, still enough to get through the next few days while he prepared for what came next. The morning passed in the rhythm of small tasks. He checked the snares and found them empty, the animals apparently finding food elsewhere now that the thaw had begun. He cut more wood from the pile, bringing it inside to replace what the fire had consumed during the night. He walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking the condition of the snow, noting where it had melted and where it remained deep. The information would be useful when the time came to travel, when he needed to know which routes were passable and which remained blocked. By midday, the clouds had cleared completely, and the sun shone down with a warmth that felt almost foreign after months of cold. He sat on a log at the edge of the clearing and let it fall on his face, feeling it on his skin, feeling the way it loosened something in his chest that had been tight since the first snow. The sound of dripping water filled the air around him, 1,000 small cascades falling from the trees and the roof of the cabin and the rocks that lined the creek. He thought about the journey ahead. The rendezvous at Green River was weeks away, maybe more, depending on the conditions in the passes and the speed of his travel. He would need to pack carefully, taking only what was necessary, leaving the rest in the cabin against his return. The furs would need to be bundled and protected from moisture. The rifle would need to be cleaned and loaded and kept ready for whatever he might encounter on the trail. The supplies would need to be calculated carefully, enough to sustain him but not so much that they slowed his progress. The planning filled his mind as he sat in the sun, turning over the details, preparing in the only way he could prepare for a journey into a world that was still half frozen, still uncertain, still capable of killing a man who made the wrong choice. He had survived the winter in this place. Now he would need to survive the journey out of it. That night, sitting by the fire, he found himself thinking about Cooper and Fitzgerald. He wondered if they had survived the winter, if they sat now before their own fire making their own plans for the journey to rendezvous. He wondered if their paths would cross, if they would meet again at Green River or somewhere on the trail, if they would recognize each other after months apart. The mountains had a way of bringing people together and pulling them apart, and he had learned to accept both without expecting either. He added wood to the fire and watched the sparks rise toward the chimney. The cabin held him in its warmth, and he let himself be held, let himself feel the comfort of this place that he had built, this place that had kept him alive through everything the winter could throw at him. He would leave it soon, would close the door and walk away and not know if he would ever return. But for now, it was still home, still his, still the center of the small world he had created in this clearing. The days that followed brought more change. The snow melted steadily now, retreating from the areas that caught the sun first, lingering in the shadows where the cold held longer. The creek ran high and dangerous, too swift to cross, too cold to fall into. The animals grew more active, more visible, preparing in their own ways for the season to come. He saw deer almost every day now, moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing, grazing on the first shoots of green that had begun to appear where the snow had retreated. He hunted when he needed to, taking a deer one afternoon with a single shot that echoed through the valley and brought silence for a long moment afterward. He field-dressed it where it fell, saving everything, carrying the meat back to the cabin in loads that took most of the day. The work was hard, but the reward was more than worth it. Fresh meat after months of dried and smoked, fat to render for cooking and light, hides to tan for new clothing and gear. The cabin filled with the smell of meat cooking and the sounds of his work. He rendered fat in a pot over the fire, the liquid gold that would fuel his lamp and season his food and protect his gear from moisture. He cut the meat into strips for drying, hanging them from the rafters where the smoke would cure them slowly. He scraped the hide clean, preparing it for tanning, a process that would take days but would produce leather that could mean the difference between life and death on the trail. The work filled the days, gave them purpose and direction. He moved through the tasks with the same methodical attention he had brought to everything since the first day in this clearing, and the days passed without his noticing, one blending into the next in the rhythm of survival. One evening, as he sat by the fire after a long day of work, he realized that the marks on the wall had reached a number that meant something. He stood and walked to the wall and ran his fingers over them, counting silently, adding them up in his head. The winter was almost over. Not quite, not yet, but close enough that he could feel it, could see it in the melting snow and the lengthening days and the changing quality of the light. He returned to the fire and sat with that knowledge, letting it settle into him. He had survived. The mountains had tested him in every way they could, and he had met every test, had endured every hardship, had continued through every moment of cold and hunger and isolation. The marks on the wall proved it, each one a small victory that added up to something larger than any single day could contain. The fire crackled and the cabin settled around him, and the night pressed against the walls with a cold that was losing its power. He sat in the warmth and the light and let himself feel whatever it was that rose in him at that moment. Not triumph, not pride, just a quiet acknowledgement of what he had done and what he continued to do. He was alive. The mountains had not killed him, and in this place at this time that was enough. The days that followed brought him closer to departure. He packed his furs into bundles that could be carried, each one wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from moisture. He checked his gear obsessively, cleaning and repairing everything that might be needed on the trail. He walked the route he would take, as far as he could go and still return before dark, scouting the conditions, memorizing the landmarks that would guide him when he finally left. The cabin began to feel different as the days passed. It was still home, still his, but it had become something else as well. A place he was preparing to leave, a shelter that would soon be empty. He found himself noticing details he had stopped seeing months ago. The way the light fell across the floor at certain times of day, the pattern of smoke stains on the ceiling, the small imperfections in the logs that he had learned to live with. He would miss this place when he left. He already missed it, and he had not yet gone. The night before his planned departure, he sat by the fire for the last time. The flames danced in the hearth, and the smoke rose straight up the chimney, and the cabin held him in its warmth as it had held him through so many nights. He did not think about the journey ahead, or about what he would find at rendezvous, or about whether he would ever return to this place. He simply sat and watched the fire and let himself be present in this moment, this last moment before everything changed. The fire burned low and he added wood. The cabin settled around him with its familiar sounds, the logs expanding and contracting, the roof beams shifting under their burden, the small creaks and groans that had become as familiar as his own breathing. He listened to them for what might be the last time, letting them fill the silence, letting them become part of his memory of this place. When he finally lay down on the sleeping platform, sleep came slowly. He lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling visible in the firelight, listening to the sounds of the cabin and the night outside. The wind had picked up again, moving through the trees with a sound like distant water, carrying with it the promise of more change, more weather, more of whatever the mountains had in store for him. He woke before dawn as he always woke and rebuilt the fire for the last time. The flames caught quickly, and he stood before them for a long moment, letting the warmth soak into him, letting himself feel the weight of this final morning. Then he ate, packed the last of his supplies, and began the slow process of closing up the cabin. The door closed behind him with a solid sound that seemed to echo through the clearing. He stood outside for a moment, looking back at the shelter he had built, the walls that had held against the winter, the roof that had shed the snow, the chimney that still released a thin thread of smoke into the morning air. The cabin would wait for him here, in this clearing, through whatever weather came before his return. If he returned, that was a question for another time. He turned and began to walk, following the route he had scouted, the snowshoes carrying him over the softening surface of the snow. The creek ran beside him for a while, its sound a constant companion, then curved away into the trees. The forest opened and closed around him, revealing glimpses of the mountains beyond, the peaks still white with snow, the sky above them the pale blue of early spring. He walked through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only to rest and eat and check his bearings. The landmarks he had memorized appeared when he expected them, confirming his route, guiding him forward. The snow conditions varied, some areas still deep and soft, others where the wind had swept the ground clear. He adjusted his pace accordingly, conserving energy where he could, pushing harder where he needed to. By late afternoon, he had reached the first ridge, the place from which he could see the valley beyond, the route that would lead him eventually to the river and the trading posts and the rendezvous. He stopped there for a long moment, looking back the way he had come. The cabin was invisible now, lost in the trees and the distance, but he knew it was there, waiting for him, if he chose to return. He turned and continued down the far side of the ridge, into the valley, toward whatever came next. The snowshoes carried him forward, and the mountains rose around him, and the sky stretched overhead, and he walked on through the afternoon and into the evening, alone in the vastness, moving toward a future he could not see but could only trust would be there when he arrived. The first night on the trail was different from the nights in the cabin. He built a small fire in a sheltered spot, using techniques he had learned through months of practice, coaxing flames from damp wood and cold air. The fire burned weakly at first, then grew stronger as he fed it, casting a small circle of light in the gathering darkness. He sat close to it, eating from his supplies, listening to the sounds of the forest around him. The night was cold, but not as cold as the winter nights had been. He wrapped himself in his blanket and lay close to the fire, sleeping in fragments, waking when the cold pressed too close, adding wood to the flames, sleeping again. The rhythm was familiar, comfortable even, the same pattern that had sustained him through months of isolation. Morning came gray and still. He rebuilt the fire and ate and packed his gear and continued down the valley. The snow conditions improved as he descended, the depths decreasing, the surface hardening where the sun had touched it. He walked faster now, covering ground more quickly, the rhythm of movement carrying him forward through the hours. The days on the trail blended into each other, each one similar to the last, each one bringing him closer to his destination. He crossed streams that ran high with meltwater, picking his way carefully across logs and rocks, avoiding the cold rush of the current. He climbed ridges and descended into valleys, following game trails and old routes that had been used by trappers for years before he ever came to these mountains. He saw animals in increasing numbers, deer and elk and once a bear that had emerged from its den and stood watching him from a distance before ambling away into the trees. The mountains began to open up as he traveled, the peaks spreading out on either side, the valleys widening into broader spaces. He could see further now, could pick out landmarks that told him he was approaching the river, the great waterway that would lead him eventually to the rendezvous. The knowledge pushed him forward, gave his steps a purpose beyond the simple act of moving through the landscape. One afternoon, he crested a ridge and saw the river below him, a broad ribbon of gray-blue winding through the valley, its surface still dotted with ice in places but mostly open, mostly free. He stood and looked at it for a long time, letting the sight settle into him. The river meant the end of the trail. The river meant boats and traders and other men. The river meant the rendezvous, and all that came with it, the noise and the crowding and the complications of human contact after months of solitude. He camped that night near the river, building his fire on a gravel bar where the water had deposited smooth stones and driftwood. The sound of the current filled the darkness, a constant presence that replaced the silence of the mountains. He sat by the fire and listened to it, feeling the weight of the journey behind him, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The next morning, he followed the river downstream, staying close to the bank where the walking was easiest. The trail became more distinct as he traveled, marked by the passage of other men, other travelers who had come this way before him. He found old campfires, discarded gear, the bones of animals that had been killed and eaten. The signs of human presence grew more frequent as he continued, and with them grew a feeling he could not quite name, something between anticipation and reluctance. By midday, he could see smoke rising in the distance, a thin column against the sky that marked the location of the rendezvous. He stopped and stood for a long moment, looking at it, letting himself feel whatever rose in him at the sight. Then he continued forward, step by step, toward the smoke and the voices and the crowded chaos of the gathering place. The rendezvous was everything he remembered and nothing like what he remembered. The noise hit him first, a wall of sound after months of silence, voices and laughter and the clank of trade goods and the occasional shot from someone testing a rifle. The smell came next, smoke and food and unwashed bodies and the heavy scent of furs. The press of people followed, men moving everywhere. Some he recognized, most he did not, all of them carrying the marks of the winter on their faces and their gear. He found a place at the edge of the gathering and set up his camp, building a small fire, arranging his furs where they could be seen by potential buyers. The work was familiar, comfortable, a routine that carried him through the chaos of the first hours. When he was settled, he sat by his fire and watched the activity around him, letting himself adjust to the presence of other people after so long alone. Men came to look at his furs, to bargain, to talk. He exchanged words with them, short conversations that felt strange after months of silence, his voice rough from disuse. They told him news from the mountains, from the trading posts, from the world beyond. Some of it mattered, most of it did not. He listened and nodded and said little, watching the faces of the men who spoke, reading them the way he had learned to read the mountains. Days passed in the rhythm of the rendezvous. He traded his furs for supplies, for powder and lead and tobacco and coffee, for the things he would need for another season in the mountains. He ate food that others had prepared, drank whiskey that burned going down, slept through the night without waking to add wood to the fire. The days blurred together in a different way than they had in the cabin, crowded with sensation and interaction, leaving little space for thought. He saw Cooper one afternoon, across the crowded space of the rendezvous. The stocky man stood by a fire with a cup in his hand, his weathered face split by a grin as he talked with someone beside him. He walked over without thinking, drawn by something he could not name, and when Cooper looked up and saw him, the grin widened. "Well now," Cooper said, "look what the mountains coughed up. Figured you for froze solid months ago." He shook his head, not sure what to say. "Made it through." Cooper nodded, studying him with the same assessing look he remembered from the cabin. "Figured you might. Had that look about you." He gestured to the man beside him. "This here's Williams. Trapped the bighorn this winter. Williams, this is the one I told you about. Built his first cabin with nothing but an axe and pure stubbornness." Williams extended a hand, and he took it, feeling the calluses that matched his own. The three of them stood by the fire, talking about the winter, about the trails, about the furs they had taken and the ones that got away. The conversation flowed easily, the way it did between men who had shared the same hardships, who understood without explanation what the mountains demanded. Fitzgerald showed up later, drawn by the fire and the voices. He looked older than he had in the fall, more lined, but his eyes were the same, clear and alert and missing nothing. He nodded when he saw who sat by the fire, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than words could have. The four of them sat together that night, sharing food and drink and stories, the fire between them casting the same kind of light it had cast in the cabin months before. The noise of the rendezvous surrounded them, but they sat in their own small circle, connected by something that went beyond the casual associations of the gathering. He asked about their winter and they told him. Close calls and narrow escapes, good hunting and lean times, storms that had tested their shelter and cold that had tested their will. They asked about his winter and he told them, the words coming slowly at first, then more easily as the night wore on. The cabin, the storms, the long months of isolation, the slow accumulation of days marked on the wall. Cooper listened without comment, nodding occasionally. When he finished, Cooper spoke. "You'll be back out there next season, I reckon." It was not a question, but he answered anyway. "Reckon so." Fitzgerald grunted. "Mountains get in a man's blood. Hard to get them out once they're there." They sat with that for a while, watching the fire, listening to the sounds of the night around them. The rendezvous continued its noise in the background, but they had created their own space within it, a small pocket of silence and understanding that needed no words to sustain it. Later, when the fire had burned low and the others had drifted away to their own camps, he sat alone and looked up at the sky. The stars were the same stars that had hung over the cabin all winter, the same stars that had watched him through every cold night and every long day. They looked different here, surrounded by the lights of the rendezvous, but they were the same. Nothing had changed except his position in the landscape. He thought about the cabin, about the clearing and the creek and the smoke-stained ceiling. He thought about returning there when the rendezvous ended, when the season turned again and the mountains called him back. He would go, he knew. There was no question about it. The mountains had claimed him, as they claimed all the men who stayed too long, who learned to read their signs and survived their tests. But that was weeks away. For now, there was the fire and the night and the distant sound of voices and the comfort of other men sleeping nearby. For now, there was this moment, this pause between seasons, this brief interval of human contact before the isolation returned. He added wood to the fire and watched the flames catch and grow. The cabin was waiting for him, somewhere back in the mountains, through the passes and across the valleys and along the trails he had learned to follow. He would find his way back to it when the time came. For now, he sat by this fire, in this place, and let the night hold him as it had held him through so many nights before. The stars wheeled overhead, and the fire burned low, and he sat until his eyes grew heavy, then lay down and slept more deeply than he had since leaving the cabin. The mountains waited, patient and indifferent, and he slept within their reach, carried by dreams of snow and silence and the small shelter he had built with his own hands. The morning light found him already awake, lying still on his blanket with his eyes open to the gray sky above. The sounds of the rendezvous were already beginning around him, voices calling out, the crackle of fires being rebuilt, the occasional sharp report of a rifle from somewhere in the trees. He lay for a long moment without moving, letting the sounds wash over him, letting himself feel the strangeness of waking among other men after so many months alone. He rebuilt his own fire when he finally rose, the motions automatic, his hands finding the familiar rhythm of kindling and fuel without requiring thought. The flames caught quickly, and he set water to heat for coffee, one of the luxuries he had traded for in the first days of the gathering. The smell of it brewing brought men from nearby camps, drawn by the aroma, and he shared what he had because that was the way of things out here, today you, tomorrow me. The days at rendezvous passed in a rhythm that was both familiar and strange. He traded when he needed to, talked when the mood took him, sat silent by his fire when it did not. Men came and went, faces he recognized from previous seasons and faces he had never seen before, all of them carrying the marks of the winter on their bodies and their gear. Stories were exchanged like currency, each man's account of survival adding to the collective knowledge of what the mountains demanded and what they gave in return. He learned that some men had not made it through the winter. Names he remembered from the fall were mentioned in the past tense, accompanied by shrugs and brief accounts of how they had died. A man named Thompson had frozen in his sleep during the deep cold, found by his partners when they checked on him in the spring. 2 brothers named McCall had been caught in an avalanche while crossing a pass, their bodies not yet recovered. A trapper called Frenchie had simply vanished, his cabin found empty, his fate unknown. He listened to these accounts without comment, filing them away in the same part of his mind where he kept track of game trails and weather patterns and the locations of good campsites. The information might prove useful someday, or it might not. Either way, it was part of the ongoing story of the mountains, a story that included him now, included his own survival, included the cabin that still waited for him in the clearing. Cooper found him one afternoon sitting by his fire, staring into the flames with the kind of attention that suggested his mind was elsewhere. The stocky man settled onto a log across from him without asking, the way men did when they had shared enough hardship to make formalities unnecessary. Thinking about heading back soon, Cooper said. Not a question, just a statement offered for consideration. He looked up, meeting Cooper's eyes. The mountains were pulling at him too. Then, they always did after a certain amount of time among crowds and noise. When? He asked. Couple days. Maybe 3. Fitzgerald's got business to finish. Then we'll go. He nodded, understanding. The same business that occupied everyone here, the endless cycle of trade and preparation that connected the mountains to the world beyond. Your cabin still standing? Cooper asked. Far as I know. Cooper grunted. Figured you'd want to check on it. We could travel together as far as the fork, then go our separate ways. The offer was practical, not sentimental. Traveling together meant shared watches, shared fires, shared labor. It meant safety in numbers through country that could still kill a man alone. It meant nothing more than that and everything that mattered. He nodded again. I'll be ready. They left 3 days later, the 3 of them, Cooper and Fitzgerald and him, packing their gear at first light and moving out of the rendezvous while most of the camp still slept. The trail led away from the river, climbing into the hills, back toward the mountains that had held them all winter. The morning was cool and clear, the sky a pale blue that promised warmth later, and they walked in silence for the first few hours, each man lost in his own thoughts. By midday, they had put enough distance behind them that the sounds of the rendezvous had faded completely, replaced by the familiar silence of the forest. They stopped to rest by a stream, eating from their supplies, drinking the cold, clear water that ran over rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow. Fitzgerald produced a piece of dried meat from his pack and chewed it slowly, his eyes on the ridge ahead. Another week, he said, more to himself than to them. Maybe 10 days, depending on the snow. Cooper nodded. The passes would be the test. The snow would be melting fast now, but that brought its own dangers, slides and unstable footing and streams running too high to cross. They would need to pick their route carefully, read the signs the mountains gave them, adjust their pace to conditions that could change without warning. They traveled on through the afternoon, making good time on the well-defined trail that had been used by generations of men moving between the rendezvous and the trapping grounds. The walking was easy compared to what they had faced in the winter, the snow patchy now, the ground firm beneath it in most places. They camped that night in a sheltered spot near a stand of pines, building a fire that felt almost luxurious after months of rationing fuel. The second day brought them into higher country, where the snow still lay deep in the shadows and the air held a sharper edge. They moved more slowly here, picking their way through drifts that had not yet softened, watching for signs of instability on the slopes above them. Fitzgerald led, his experience reading the terrain guiding their route, and they followed without question, trusting the knowledge that came from years of moving through these mountains. By the third day, they had reached the fork that Cooper had mentioned, the place where their trails would separate. His route led north, toward the creek and the clearing where the cabin waited. Cooper and Fitzgerald would continue west, toward their own camps, their own shelters, their own waiting isolation. They stopped at the fork and built a small fire, sharing a meal that felt like ceremony though no one spoke of it. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the snow, and the mountains rose around them in every direction, indifferent to the small drama of parting that played out at their feet. You know where to find us, Cooper said when the meal was done. If you need. He nodded. And you know where to find me. Fitzgerald extended his hand, and he took it, feeling the calluses and the strength that came from years of the same work he had been doing. Cooper did the same, a brief clasp that said everything that needed saying. Then they were gone, 2 figures moving west along the trail, growing smaller with each step until they disappeared into the trees. He stood and watched until he could no longer see them, then turned north and began his own journey, alone again, moving toward the cabin that waited in the clearing. The trail was familiar now, the same route he had followed on his way to Rendezvous, reversed and transformed by the changing season. The snow had melted further in the weeks he had been away, revealing ground that had not seen sunlight since the fall. Streams ran higher, louder, their voices filling the valleys with the sound of melting. Birds had returned, their calls echoing through the trees, and he saw more animals than he had seen all winter, deer and elk and once a moose that stood and watched him pass with the placid indifference of something that knew it had nothing to fear. He camped alone each night, building small fires, eating from his supplies, watching the stars wool overhead. The silence was different now than it had been in the winter. It held promise instead of threat, the sounds of life returning woven through it like threads of color in a gray cloth. He slept well, deeply, waking each morning with the light and moving on without hurry. The landmarks appeared when he expected them, the ridge where he had stopped to look back, the valley where the creek ran beside the trail, the final climb that would bring him to the clearing. He crested that rise on the 5th day after leaving the fork and stopped, looking down at the cabin below. It stood exactly as he had left it, the walls square and solid, the roof intact, the door closed against whatever weather had passed while he was away. Snow still lingered in the shadows around it, but the clearing itself was mostly bare, the ground soft and wet with melt. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, but the cabin did not need smoke now. It simply waited, patient as the mountains themselves. He walked down the slope toward it, his steps carrying him through the wet grass and the patches of lingering snow, past the woodpile that had shrunk during his absence, past the creek that ran high and fast with meltwater, past the trees he had cut and the ones he had left standing. The cabin grew larger with each step, more solid, more real, until he stood before it with his hand on the door. He pushed it open and stood in the doorway, looking inside. The fire pit was cold, the ashes gray and undisturbed. The smoke rack hung empty where the meat had once cured. The shelves held the supplies he had left behind, untouched, waiting. The marks on the wall still recorded the days of his winter, rows of hash marks that led up to the point where he had stopped counting. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and the cabin enclosed him in its familiar space, its familiar silence, its familiar smell of wood smoke and old fire and the slow decay of organic things. He stood for a long moment in the center of the room, letting the feeling of it settle into him, letting himself be home again. Then he set down his pack and began the work of reopening the cabin. He rebuilt the fire, using wood he had left stacked beside the hearth, watching the flames catch and grow until they filled the space with warmth and light. He fetched water from the creek, breaking through the thin ice that had formed along the edges. He checked his supplies, took inventory of what remained, began to plan for the days ahead. The work filled the afternoon, and by the time darkness began to fall, the cabin had returned to something like its winter state. The fire burned steadily in the hearth. The water pot sat near it, warming. His gear was arranged in its familiar places, his rifle on its pegs above the door, his blankets spread on the sleeping platform, his possible bag hanging from a hook near the fire. He sat on the three-legged stool and looked around at what he had built, what he had returned to, what would hold him through whatever came next. The cabin had waited for him, as he had known it would. It had stood through the storms and the thaws and the long weeks of his absence, and it would stand through whatever followed, for as long as he needed it to stand. The fire crackled and the cabin settled around him with its familiar sounds, and he sat in the warmth and the light and let himself feel whatever rose in him at that moment. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement of the continuity of things. He had left and he had returned. The cabin had held and he had held. The mountains had done what mountains do and he had done what men do, and for this moment that was enough. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both familiar and new. He worked when work needed doing, rested when it did not, explored the country around the cabin as the snow retreated and revealed the landscape beneath. He found places he had not seen before, small meadows where wildflowers would bloom later in the season, rocky outcroppings that offered views of the mountains in every direction, streams he had not known existed that ran clear and cold and full of fish. He fished when he wanted to eat, using hooks he had traded for at rendezvous and line made from twisted sinew. The fish were plentiful in the streams now, fresh run from the larger rivers, eager to bite at anything that looked like food. He caught more than he needed sometimes, smoking the excess, adding to the store that would carry him through the next winter if he chose to stay. The thought of another winter in the cabin came to him often as the days passed. It was not a decision he needed to make yet, not something that required immediate attention, but the idea was there, waiting in the back of his mind, ready to be examined when the time came. He had survived one winter. He could survive another. The cabin would hold, the mountains would test him as they always tested men who stayed too long, and he would meet those tests as he had met the ones before. But that was months away. For now, there was spring, and the slow unfolding of the world as it woke from its frozen sleep. He watched the leaves appear on the trees, first as tiny buds, then as pale green shoots, then as the full canopy that would shade the clearing through the summer. He watched the wildflowers bloom in the meadows, carpets of color that appeared overnight and lasted for days before fading. He watched the animals raise their young, the deer with their spotted fawns, the birds with their nests full of eggs, the rabbits with their litters hidden in the brush. The cabin changed with the season as well. He opened the window more often, letting in the warm air and the sounds of the forest. He spent more time outside than in, cooking over an open fire near the creek, sleeping under the stars when the nights were warm enough. The cabin became a place to return to rather than a place to live in, a shelter against the occasional storm rather than a fortress against constant cold. He thought about Cooper and Fitzgerald sometimes, wondering if they had reached their own cabins, if they were living through the same spring, watching the same transformations. He thought about the men he had met at rendezvous, the ones who had survived and the ones who had not, the ones who would return to the mountains and the ones who would not. The thought came and went without weight, without urgency, just another part of the background of his mind. One evening, sitting by the creek as the sun set behind the mountains, he found himself thinking about the marks on the wall. He had not added to them since returning from rendezvous, had not felt the need to count the days in the same way. The urgency of winter survival had passed, replaced by something softer, something that did not require the same constant accounting. But the marks were still there, recording the days of his first winter in this place. He would add to them when winter came again, if winter came again, if he was still here to face it. For now, they stood as a record of what he had done, proof that he had survived something that had killed other men, evidence that he belonged in these mountains as much as anyone could belong in a place that did not care whether you lived or died. The sun dropped behind the peaks, and the light faded from gold to gray to the deep blue of evening. He sat by the creek until the stars began to appear, then rose and walked back to the cabin, his path lit by the last glow of twilight and the first gleam of the rising moon. The fire had burned low during his absence, but he rebuilt it without thought, the motions automatic, the flames catching quickly and filling the cabin with warmth. He sat on the stool and watched them for a while, letting the day drain out of him, letting the quiet settle into his bones. The cabin held him in its familiar embrace, and he let himself be held. The mountains surrounded him, patient and indifferent, and he accepted their indifference as he accepted everything else. He was here, alive, in this place that he had built, and for this moment that was enough.